You're most welcome to this discussion of this wonderful book just published by Vishakha Desai, World as Family. We're going to have a conversation about the book. And so let me just welcome our guest today, Vishakha. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Vishakha. Thank you so much, first of all, for writing the book, which I have truly enjoyed reading, but also for making the time to be with us today for this conversation. So the way this is going to go is I'm going to ask Vishakha a few questions about the book, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. And so let me start with the title of this book, Vishakha. Can you talk to us about why World as Family? Why did you choose this title? What does it mean?
First, Fernando, thank you very much for having this conversation. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you because I can't think of a better person to actually talk about things that are very close to my heart, and I know your heart. So thank you for doing this. And it's among the early programs that I'm doing, so that's terrific. Now, back to World as Family. You know, this phrase is very well known in India. It is actually a 3,000-year-old phrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, treating the world as family. We've known about it. It's almost cliched in India. It's on the front of the Parliament Hall. So it's quite well known. But as I began to think about writing this book, which was really at the suggestion with conversations with my younger colleagues, students, AFS students, exchange students elsewhere, it kind of came in handy for me to say that as I tried to understand how did I become so passionate about this idea of global belonging, if you will, it seemed to make sense to use this title. But I have to tell you that it wasn't absolutely certain that I would use the title. So, in fact, at the end of, let's say, the beginning of 2021, and it was just at the end of February. I had finished the draft. I was getting ready to get it to the editors, and I actually was thinking of not using the title because a number of my younger colleagues and even older colleagues said, "Ah, it sounds so idealistic, so aspirational in this world of anti-globalism that you should really think of another title." So I was almost thinking I wasn't going to use it. Then COVID happens. And I felt that there was nothing more important than actually the message of that particular phrase. We all know what family means. We don't always know how to think about family in a global context. So I realized that actually, in a functional family, we have to recognize that we are individual, but we're also part of a unit. In a functional family, we realize that sometimes you might be disappointed by one of your siblings, but you got to let go of those slights because the unit matters. And I actually realize that our global family is pretty dysfunctional right now. And so, if anything, even if we don't know how to do it, we have to figure out because COVID, along with climate crisis, actually teaches us that we better figure out how to think of the world as family. So that's the reason why I chose the title.
Thank you, Vishakha. For those of you who haven't read it, World as Family is a memoir, is the memoir of the journey of Vishakha becoming a global citizen. Vishakha was born to parents who had been participants in Gandhi's struggle for freedom in India. As she grows up in Ahmedabad, attends a local school, which provided her many opportunities for experiential learning and for learning about India's rich history and culture, as her school would take her and her classmates in trains to explore different places, um, to then arriving at the age of 17 to the United States as an exchange student at the age of 17 to and then to go back to India to pursue studies in politics, and then come back to the US and begin to work as a museum educator, and then to begin to do her graduate work in art history in the US. And throughout it all, combining her interests in dance, art, politics and academia, in a career that involves art education, curatorial work, leading the Asian Society, and teaching in higher education. So it's a fascinating journey. It's a book that I enjoyed both for its humor. There are some places which I will not report, not to spoil the surprise for the reader, where I burst out laughing. And there are some places that are really striking for their honesty and in what you say. But one of the themes in this book is how a global mind evolves, how a global citizen is shaped. And in this chronicle of your own trajectory, Vishaka, we see how the strong roots that you had the opportunity to develop an Indian identity, to eventually develop this double consciousness as a result of acquiring a second culture and learning to straddle two cultures, to eventually becoming not just of two cultures, but of the world. And you conclude the book just before the chapter where you talk about the COVID moment, reflecting on your own work with global leaders and with your own students, and explaining that for them, the process that took a lifetime for you happens much more instantaneously, much faster, without the benefit of this gradual progression through which your own global mind developed. So can you talk to us about that development of your own global mind and about the challenges and the tensions that you see in a world where we learn to be global much more instantaneously?
You know, you have encapsulated the book so well, and it's very hard to actually piece these pieces apart. But I will say that one of the things that really struck me as I work with young people is that I've actually had the luxury of evolving and adding layers, partly because of the kind of life that I have led. And the purpose of writing the book was to say, these are layers, these are contextual, they don't happen overnight, and they have lots and lots of little roots. So, the second part of the title, A Journey of Multi Rooted Belonging, is a very important part for me because I'm trying to actually reclaim global to say it isn't rootless. It isn't just traveling around the world, being out there in an abstract sense. It does have something to do with this layering. But I also recognize, as I work with young people, is that that luxury they don't have. They are global natives in a way, in that the world is in their palm, in their cell phone. You can access anything, anywhere. And often they ask me and say, but is it possible to have that capacious sense of global belonging and yet be locally rooted? And so part of it is an effort to say, you must actually learn to do that. So let me give you an example of one of the young people that I was just talking to, Asia 21 young leader from Asia Society. And she said, but how do I make sense of the fact that with climate crisis, we're all talking about eating with locally sourced food,
Mm.
not having things come and travel from everywhere. And one of the things we talked about was, and I talk about it in the book as well, is that actually some things require local action in order to understand the global problem. But the point is never to understand local without the global connection and global without the local implications. So, in a way, as some people have said, you have to learn to chew gum and walk at the same time. We have to learn to be locally rooted and globally conscious. We don't have a choice.
Mm.
Crisis after crisis actually point that out. And in a way, it's my effort to write and develop this, but I also think that young people are way ahead of us. They understand that you need to do that. They don't always have the tools. And as you know, studies after studies show that young people today, especially 18 to 24, that Generation Z, is aware of this, but they don't feel like they have the tools. And we have not done a good job of creating tools for them. We haven't created a good job of telling stories. So my effort is to tell that story not academically, purposely, but in a personal way to say this is not all fun and games. It isn't something like a kumbaya moment. It takes a lot of work and there are a lot of pains involved because you might feel that, but others don't see you that way. That's a problem too. So we
It
got
really
to
is.
manage
It's
that.
it's a it's a masterful example of reflection. And in fact, just today I've had office hours with students, and I've been recommending to each one of them, you should read this book because it's a good example on how to do reflection, how to do deep reflection. Now, one of the lines running through this book, which obviously interested me especially as an educator, are the various experiences that supported the development of your global mind. And in your life, there is a myriad of those, so many that, and they build on each other, that it's very difficult to tease apart the influence, the distinct influence of each one of them. I was, for example, very interested in how your early education was very experiential. It actually taught you to learn from experience. And the section in which you talk about the influence that Maria Montessori had in education in India. Um, I was also very interested in that year that you spent as an exchange student in the United States. So can you talk to us about the contribution of that experience? I know that when you were president of the Asia Society, one of your passions was to advance global education for American students, to provide more schools, more children in schools, especially in inner city schools, opportunities for students to develop global awareness, to become cosmopolitan. So talk to us about that experience as an exchange, and beyond that, about exchanges more generally as an avenue to develop that global consciousness.
You know, it's so important that we talk about that. It's actually, there are several chapters, but one chapter that I write about is called The Strangers Become Family. And I came to this country, I hate to tell you, but it was more than 50 years ago. So that was a long time ago, at a time when we couldn't make a phone call to India. And it took 3 days to register a call to talk to people, right? So that's kind of the situation it was. And it's 1966, 65 is when the immigration laws changed. So there's hardly any Indians in this country. So it's important for people to recognize that. I come here and I live with an American family. And the story that I know you laughed a lot about, and people love that story, and I talk about that story in the book, and that's I call the lobster story. You know, coming from a family of complete vegetarians, I didn't even have eggs. And in America at that point, people thought vegetarian meant you ate seafood and chicken, that you just didn't eat meat. Well, so first day we go to Sagaponack, where my American family had a home. And it's long story short, but essentially we go to a market. I'd never been to a fish market in my life, and they buy these two creatures that I thought must be for their fish tank or something because I'd seen fish tanks in India. You know, people have those kinds of things in ornamentation. And it turns out, and then they call me back. I try to see this, and there are two lobsters. And I hear these little sounds coming from the water. And I thought, oh my God, they're going to make me eat this thing. And I just freaked out. And I said, I'm going for a bike ride and I'll be right back. I mean, it was hard enough that none of the kids, the two sisters who were there, were not there. I come from a family of seven. So it was already pretty intense to think that I'm going to be with these two old people and have no kids all around me. And I almost get killed because I'm on the wrong side of the street. Long story short, on that bike ride, I realized that if people came to my house and didn't eat anything that my family cooked, how would I feel? How would we feel? And I said to myself, you know, my parents never said it was religious reason. It was more Gandhian than religious or anything. So I said, I have to eat these things. It doesn't matter. For me, why that's a seminal experience is because I recognize the importance of empathy, putting myself into other people's shoes to recognize that I have to think about how would they feel if I didn't eat it. And that's such a basic but important principle before you get to the idea of a global belonging. Because in order to treat the world as family, You got to think about other people's feelings, other people's attitudes, and not make opinions or judgments about that. So that becomes a very seminal experience for me. The other experience was that it was the height of Vietnam War. And we had one of the first student body high school protests against Vietnam. And I was the closest that they could get to anybody Vietnamese because, oh, India, Vietnam, one didn't know the difference. And so I was asked to speak. And I began to realize that people thought of Vietnam as war, not a culture, not a history, not a society. And I kept thinking, gee, what if India had war with the United States? They wouldn't know that we have 5,000-year-old history. And I spoke about that. So to me, that was the beginning of my understanding of cultural and political relationship. That became, and I didn't realize that at the time, but it became my passion for the rest of my life. So there are things that happen in those kinds of experiences that really open your mind as well as open your heart. And that's the importance of those kinds of experiences.
To build on that point, you're beginning to realize that what makes war possible is the dehumanization of the other. And that if people thought of these as people with families, with a culture, it would be much harder to kill them, right? And throughout the book, you talk several times about the arts as an avenue to help us see our shared humanity with other people, and about arts education, which of course has been so central to your career as a form of global education. Can you say more about that?
Again, it's there's so much to say, but if I come back to the book and my personal experience, I use the example of being at the Cleveland Museum of Art as a 21-year-old, coming back to America, and somebody sees me doing a dance performance. I was trained as a classical Indian dancer. And I always thought when I was in Santa Barbara as a high school student that it was important to look at dance and art generally. So, in my own naive way, I would put these things together. So, I did that in Cleveland, where I landed at 21-year-old. And out of that, I got a call from the Cleveland Museum education head to say, will you come and work for us? And so I was like, what? I didn't know anything about museum education or anything else. I was a political science major, so this was sort of a different way. But then my first job was to work with fifth grade East Cleveland public school kids primarily African American, who come from very, very, very disadvantaged communities in that area. And so I wear my sari. I have a picture of me with these kids in the book. And I thought, oh, I'm going to really talk about India and Indianness. And so I asked them if they knew where I was from and what it was. And they said, you look foreigner, but we don't know. So I said, oh, I'm Indian. And immediately they said, what kind of Indian? Hopi, Navajo? And I sort of get into this conversation about, well, Columbus made the mistake. And I'll never forget this little girl who then says to me, that was a long time ago. He made a mistake and we still called him that? This is long before we started using the word Native American, right? And so I, in fact, as a 21-year-old said, sure beats me. But then we go to a dancing Shiva sculpture and we start talking about the dance and movement, and they start taking the pose. They literally didn't know where India was or who I was. 6 weeks later, they used to come to me once a week, all school day. This is a very innovative program. And the museum had worked with the public schools and so forth and so on. At the end of 6 weeks, those sculptures were their friends. They could talk to those sculptures. They actually felt like they knew something about India and culture. So, especially in the current moment, when we really get focused on cultural appropriation and exploration, sometimes I think we also should remember that art, as contested as it may be in the museum context, we have to remember that you can't put art in a box. It's as much about specificity, sometimes about power, as it's also about transcending the specificity of geography, history, culture, and open up what Azar Nafisi, the great Iranian American writer, has called the Republic of Imagination. I think that idea is inherent in art making, and because it is both about specificity and it's about not that specificity. And so for me, that power of art is really what got me going in museum education and museums as possibility of institutions of culture and transformation. Doesn't always work that way, and I realize that I myself have had questions, but there is something about art that has a power that we mustn't forget, even as we talk about all the problems that art institutions contend with today.
It's also art an opportunity for religious literacy development. It's an opportunity to open up your understanding, your empathy to the way in which people from other religions see the world. And in the book, you talk about the use of religion for the opposite purposes, for the purpose of dividing. You talk, in fact, about that experience in the US where you are traveling the US and you hear for the first time a sermon which is being used to justify war in the name of religion. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, that I have a chapter on Vietnam for that reason, and I think that is actually so relevant today in India, in America, and elsewhere, all over Europe and everywhere else. That it's religion is sort of like life, you know. It can be used for very positive purposes to really think about how many religions shared certain values, and it can be used also to divide people. It's up to us to figure out how to use it the other way. So the example you talk about has so much to do with I was in Texas after having done protests against the war, etc. And then I end up in this tiny town called Spearman, Texas. And the family takes me to the Sunday sermon. And I, of course, wear my Indian best and, look nice and so forth and so on. And the guy goes on, the priest, talk about why we're in Vietnam is the last word of Christ. Because these are heathens and we have to actually teach them what is a Christian value. And it didn't occur to him when I was introduced to him afterwards that somehow I too would be that heathen because I didn't have that religion. And it kind of made me realize that once religion gets into this discussion, the belief systems take over and then rational thinking goes away. And that's something that I've really learned over time that religion is a powerful tool to divide people. And we know that all over the world, whether it's Israel, whether it is India and Pakistan, that we have to work harder to find what connects us, because that's possible too, than what divides us.
There is an interesting flow in the book. There is this crescendo of a person that is becoming more and more global, that is doing more and more to promote global. And then we come to the current moment of backlash against globalization, of rising intolerance, both in India and the United States, your two countries. Now, isn't there a paradox, Vishaka, in the fact that 50 years after you came to the US as an exchange student, there are such powerful forces in both countries, but also in other parts of the world, pushing us away from the very idea of world as family, even though the opportunities for global education are more available than they were to you and to other students when you were in school. So, what do you think explains this backlash, and
Right.
what can we do about it as educators?
You know, in early 90s, when I started thinking about some of these issues, partly because globalization was really taking force, one person that I really learned most from was Dewey Ming, who used to be at Harvard and is a philosophy professor, then he's gone to Beda, is now retired. And he had done a small, very short piece. And essentially, his articulation was that globalization and balkanization are two sides of the coin.
Hmm.
And what he talked about was to recognize that precisely as world begins to get interconnected and become more and more interdependent, and the borders become harder to keep up, is when people will hold on to small patches of their land, small patches of their identity, because it's scary. It's scary when things become too open. And so one way to deal with it is to say, okay, it's only this and not that. So the divisiveness is actually the other side of the coin of recognizing that the world is coming together, whether you like it or not. And I think that once you look at it that way, it's less of a paradox, it's more of a choice. And what I think about is that it's absolutely true that the everything we see even today is as much about the divisiveness as it's about the effort not to do that. So for President Biden to finally agree that you're going to let go of the intellectual property for the vaccine and open it up to go to the world, or the 40 countries are coming in to help India, that is about recognizing that not just India needs help, but India, as the largest producer of vaccines in the world, if India is not in that position, it's going to affect everybody. So the reality of what the Secretary General of the UN has said is that COVID teaches us that nobody is safe until everybody is safe.
Mhm.
Our problem is that we don't have enough tools to put this layering of the local, global, national. When is it about national sovereignty? When is it about global safety? When is it about local connection? I think that people are capable of thinking of community beyond themselves. So we have to actually figure out as educators, how do we continue to foster that? I always look at it, those realists who push hard on me for sure, that this book is a little too idealistic. And I said, you know what? The truth is, give me a choice. Glass is half full and half empty at the same time. Are you going to work harder to make the glass fuller? Or are you going to push hard on the glass being empty? It's our
That's
choice.
wonderful. That's wonderful. Vishaka, let's stay on COVID for a moment, which is the subject of the very last chapter of the book, in which you talk about the COVID moment. What do you think are the implications of this moment, where we have opportunities such as today? We have a wonderful group of people who I'm going to open the mic for in just a moment, joining us from different parts of the world. Probably wouldn't have happened in ordinary times, right? What do you think are the implications of this moment for the development of this consciousness of world as family?
Well, I think that as we reflect on this moment, and we've been living it for the year, all of us who used to travel all the time, I'm sure that was true of Fernando for you too, that between March and December, I canceled 8 trips. And yet, while I'm sitting in my home, I've been connecting to more people around more parts of the world than ever before. So there is something about that alone together kind of an idea that is very much a prevalent idea today. And at the same time, we also know that you could build walls and try to protect yourself from everybody else. But mask to me is a perfect metaphor. Mask is as much to protect ourselves as to protect others from us. There is some notion of interdependence that is very visceral right now. And at the same time, what I keep saying is that we have to understand our independence in relation to our interdependence. That is the teachable moment of this time. We could choose to go back into our shell. I don't think it's going to work because there'll be another pandemic. Climate crisis is upon us. We don't have a choice. We have to figure out how to do this. But that does mean that we have to look at it in layers, not just something is over there, is going to stay over there. It isn't going to stay over there. And that is the really fundamental moment of this time. As my dancer friend, Faustin Lenacula, who I quote in the book, says, now we know the world lives in our body. COVID reminds us that the world lives in our body, and it is through our body that we better connect to the world.
And I'm so glad you're focusing on the book on the half full. I did find the book very hopeful. As someone who tends to be fairly hopeful myself, and that's why we sent a note about this event and about the book to the more than 1,000 participants in this think tank on global education I convene at Harvard every year. And I see some of them here. And I'm going to call on you soon, Sergio, to ask one of the first questions. So before I open the floor for questions from those who have joined us, let me ask you one last question. As we're meeting today, there is evidence of growing acts of hate against Asian Americans in the United States. And so, as an Asian American woman, and as someone who has studied culture and intercultural relations all your life and devoted your life to fostering intercultural understanding, how do you explain this hate? What are its roots? And what can we do about it?
I've been again writing and thinking about this a lot, partly from a personal perspective, but also as somebody who has been in this world, the business for a long time. And I think that how ironic it is that here we are, a country of hyphenated identities. But we haven't completely come to terms with the fact that hyphenated identity need not mean binary identities. For Asian Americans, often I have argued that what connects us is not our Asianness. What connects us is our American experience. So, here in the month of May, as we celebrate the Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, it's worthwhile to remember that the month came to be as it was is because it marks the important historical moments when people of Asian origin came to America. It was not anything about Asia, yet, ironically, why they get seen as the other is their physical Asianness. And I think that we still haven't come to terms with that it is not Asian or American, it is Asian and American. And that notion of multiplicity is implicit in this country, minus the Native Americans, I realize, and also African Americans who have other kinds of issues. But I always quote Vartan Gregorian, and somebody that I mentioned in the book too, is that he was the one who first said that every immigrant who comes to this country learns to become an American and in the process changes the notion of what it means to be American. And what I feel is that it's high time for us to recognize that to be an American is an evolving concept, precisely because we are a land of immigrants. And therefore, let's try to achieve a more perfect union by expanding our notion of Americanness, partly because it can serve as a perfect beacon to the world to say what does it mean to be a global person is to have an expansive notion of our own sense of identity, and that is ever evolving. It is not a fixed point in time. So for me, that is the potential of America. We haven't always achieved it, and what shows up with whether it's the hatred against Asian Americans, whether it is post 9/11, what happened to Sikhs and people with brown skin, or George Floyd's murder. They all are about who has more right to be here than the other person. And it's the othering and dehumanizing, as you mentioned before. So we got to humanize people by knowing their stories, by learning about how it makes them American and change what it means to be American.
This is beautiful. So let's open it up to your questions. Those of you who have joined us today, I'm going to try to please raise your hand if you want to speak, and we'll open up your mic. Let me begin with Wendy Kopp, who is here with us, another global citizen herself who has built this wonderful movement of global citizens around the world. Wendy, over to you.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Vishakha, for this beautiful discussion. I think I'm just really wondering what you think, I'm thinking particularly about just the question of, can we really achieve your beautiful vision of ensuring that everyone thinks about everyone else and, embraces the world as family without starting really young with kids? And it's interesting hearing you talk about young people, because I see so much evidence of that sentiment. And yet I think we've also seen, evidence of different sentiments. And so that's just one question for you. And what do you think it would take to really, within our schools all around the world, foster global citizenship, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good question, Wendy. And I think that I actually, believe it or not, at 2 o'clock, I'm doing a podcast for parents and to say, what does it really mean and how do we start that at home and in school? And I would say to you that for me, it really does begin with having a capacious sense of curiosity to learn about people who are different from you. Whether you learn their story, whether you see their film, whether you actually get to know them. And therefore, for parents and for teachers, it's really important to try to inculcate that early on. You can't get to the world if you're not actually learning those steps. At least from my personal experience, as I talk about in the book, it had a lot more to do with how our parents actually opened the home to people beyond people we knew. Having other people come and live with us, having lots of different kinds of people coming to the house. So you actually began to kind of feel it, that was important. The second piece is that also a sense of mutual responsibility. And therefore, recognizing, because at least I find in America, sometimes we're so focused on self expression. Very important. I recognize that. But self expression that also affects other people. And to see yourself as part of a member of a larger community, whatever that community is, I think that has to begin early on. You talk about how there are global natives, young people, but also that kind of virtual connection also closes up mind. And studies show us that in the global north, especially in America, actually all the electronic tools that are available to us, social media, actually make smaller and smaller and smaller group. In global south, people are using it to explore the world beyond where they find themselves because they find themselves very limited. So that in itself is a very interesting point, that how ironic it is the whole world comes to America. And unlike when I came in the 60s, now there's less curiosity about people other than you. And I think we got to, and I understand the cultural appropriation questions, but I also recognize that if you just get focused on being timid about exploring other cultures, you actually will just find that this is my world and this is where I'm safe and that's all I'm going to do. So we have to go beyond that and be more courageous. So that has much more to do with how we're developing this in schools. And I worry, especially about the global north, that there is a tendency to become more cliquish than otherwise. And we have to fight that if we can.
Thank you. Let me bring in a real leader in education in East Lansing, Sergio Keck, who's doing remarkable work in public schools promoting global citizenship. I'm so glad you could join us, Sergio. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Reimers, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. You made a comment that Dr. Reimers always teaches us, is that to be a global citizen, you have to be good locally. You have to start at the local level. And that's the message that we're trying to send to schools in Lansing, Michigan, and around the world that we partner with. So thank you for emphasizing that. You made another comment that you said the global family is dysfunctional. And my question is it dysfunctional because this is the period of our lives that we're living it and we're seeing it? Or how different is dysfunctional today than it was before or yesterday? has dysfunctionality always been a component of the global family?
Well, it's such a good question, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Um, I think about that a lot, and it seems to me that sovereignty of nation states have been such an important part of our life for the last 200 years, at least 200 years, but not before that. And therefore, there is this idea that somehow the nation state is the paramount modality by which we operate. At the same time, post World War II, if you recognize the amount of international organizations that were developed, there was something about the feeling that after World War II, we don't want that kind of war again. And therefore, we have to figure out how to engage the world. And to some extent, I realized that in the 60s when I came, there was a more of this sense of connecting to the world because it was important. Then, ironically, as economic globalization started taking root, with which came also exploitation, if you will, labor, other practices, all of that. But the more world became more interconnected, the more we began to feel like I have to push hard. And we have had political leaders, or the former president of this country notwithstanding, where specifically people would say to be global is to be anti-national. So the rhetoric has ratcheted up. Just as the world has become more interconnected, more people are moving today from one part of the other than ever before. And more will continue to move because of the climate crisis. The projections are that today 1 in 4 persons in the world lives in a place that they were not born in. And at the same time, there is this feeling, therefore the fear becomes stronger. So I would say to you that the paradigm of the national sovereignty has been strong always, but there have been moments when we thought somehow there were global responsibilities. There was also the way to think about the world differently. Today, because we are smaller and more interconnected, the fears are stronger. So we have to fight harder, is where I would say we have to think about. So dysfunctional is very paramount. It's very out there. It's very evident. So we have to fight harder.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to invite a phenomenal leader, former Secretary of Education of the state of Puebla, who's joining us today from Mexico. Patricia, so good to see you here. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Reimers. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for this amazing feelings that you're provoking us with all your amazing insights. So the question that I have is, we have been talking a lot about refugees and migrants. And in terms of what we have seen in terms of policies about refugees and migrants, and I'm a Mexican, I know there are a lot of Mexicans in the States and many other parts of the world. How would you recommend to those of us who are trying to change the narrative from being like migrants and refugees from this discriminated perspective to bring more into like inclusive perspective? Because for somehow we are like migrants if we move from one place to the other. So like we're just very stereotyping and keep on with that narrative. And I would love to like know your perspective on how you look at it differently. So thanks a lot.
Actually, when I was writing this book, a number of my colleagues, especially younger colleagues, said, but you've had a very privileged life. What about people who come from very different perspective, especially migrants, and how do we do that? And you're taking it to one step further, which is to say that there is a fluidity of experiences, sometimes very painful, but it doesn't stay fixed in one place. And so when I've talked to my Latinx friend, friends, they always say that actually there are so many people of the Latin American persuasion that are actually have been here for a long time, and yet the narrative of the migrants, of the narrative of somebody who comes from one place, continues to be the paramount narrative, as is true of the Asian Americans, that there is this thing, third generation Chinese American colleague of mine, born in Texas, raised in Texas, would still be asked, gee, how come you speak English so well? Or, oh, you don't have Chinese accent. And she has to say, I don't know Chinese. But that is the predominant notion of otherness that puts you in a box. So I actually think we have to tell more stories of different kinds of people, more stories of people who have done different things. And those stories have to be available to more people other than just ourselves. And children's stories, or there are stories that happen in movies. So I was just reading about, did you see the article on La Bamba? And that how this film long time ago, 30 years ago, and what they recognize is that the hope was that after that film it would go to another level, and nothing followed. When nothing follows, then it gets become fixed as the iconic. And so we have to change the iconic moments. And we have to continue to do this because without it, we won't change what it means to be American. That is the point. That America has the possibility of this capacious, growing world because the world comes here. And especially for those who have experienced different cultures, we should also recognize that agency that they bring to the life of being an American is actually helpful in the world because it's what I call the multi-rooted belonging that goes to the global belonging, creates some stability. We have that potential in America, but we don't use it to the extent that we could. And that's the journey and the challenge that we have in front of us.
Let me bring in another friend who, to add to the diversity of voices here, who comes not from education, but from the world of business, Bob Scully. It's wonderful to see you here. Over to you.
Fernando, thank you so much. I enjoyed very much the way you framed some very challenging questions to our remarkable author. And it's wonderful, Vishakha, for you to share your views and your experience. Well, I guess I do have one very challenging question, which is that if there's a major hot button issue in this country at this time, it's immigration policy. This is something you've thought a good deal about. If you were talking to members of Congress or policymakers in Washington and thinking about how we could perhaps reframe this discussion or how policymakers ought to think about the immigration policy of this country, would you have any views, or is this something that it's not something you've thought about?
No, I mean, I think about it a lot actually. And let me just say that from one particular experience, the experience that I have done some studies of, and that is the Asian American experience. And let us not forget that for the longest time, the exclusionary policies, especially against the non-Euro American groups, and it started with the first railroad workers who came. And it started, and most people don't realize that until 1950s, people of Asian origin couldn't vote in this country. And at the same time, if you look post 65, when the immigration laws changed, which was the last time the big reform happened, And today you can say that the Asian American experience shows us the kind of contributions they have made in this country have changed this country in a big way, as is true of Latinx, as is true of other communities that come here. So I do feel that diversity is the strength of America. Now, put that aside and say, okay, the immigration policy, obviously, you cannot keep complete open doors. You have to have some system. You have to develop some way of incorporating people. But I would also tell the lawmakers that if you look at our population trend, and if we all have read it, in 6 years, this is going lower, lower, and lower. We will be in a situation where you won't have enough people to do the work that needs to be done. And one of the reasons why we actually were where we were economically compared to even Europe that began to have slowed down in the growth has to do with our population was increasing, not hugely, but small amounts, both through immigration and where we were. So actually, right now, there is a labor shortage. And you have to think about the fact that a lot of the places that used to have workers can't have workers. I'm right now I'm in Long Island, the North Fork, and this is like the biggest issue because of what happened during the last administration. They can't find enough workers. So we got to figure out some sophisticated way, whether it's temporary worker permit that goes to the immigration, but immigration is the strength of this country. And one way or the other, we got to figure out how to manage this.
Vishakha,
Yeah.
speaking of world as family, your appearance today has brought a former student, a dear former student, who I hadn't seen in a long time, who's joining us from Mumbai, Parth Sarwate. Parth, do you want to say something? I'm sorry for
Yeah.
calling on you without warning.
No problem, Fernando. Thank you very much. Vishakha, this is wonderful. As soon as I saw the title of the book, I said I have to listen and understand this perspective because you know what India is going through now, and I'm sure, as the term "world as family," Vasudeva Kutumbakam, it's used very much within India to sort of talk about how they're connected to the world, but create divisions within. And this is a particularly troublesome time when education system is used in a way, and is misused in a way to create those divisions and plant seeds. As we should be planting seeds as educators of being this global citizen. The exact opposite is seen within countries.
Right.
So how do we work in this in this challenging time?
Yeah, I actually have thought a lot about it and I write about it in the book. And you'll be interested that I'm going to do a program for Asian Society India Center with Kriya University, in fact, next week. Partly because what I have recognized is that we've all learned Vasudeva Kutumbakam. We've heard it, but it's like the word global. It's become such a cliched word. We don't actually think about what does it mean. And what is so brilliant about that phrase is family is a unit we understand. That means, as our friend from East Lansing was saying, the idea of interconnectedness begins in a family and in a country and in the world. In India, we have dismembered the idea of global and the family. In order to connect those two, we absolutely must work harder within the communities to recognize that how do we treat other people within our own community matters. And education, like religion, and in India it's education and religion, is actually used to create wedges. And everything we can do, we have to fight it. But one thing I would say is that in India, often when I talk to my friends who don't have deep grounding in the Indian traditions, they are seen automatically as cosmopolitan and therefore not Indian enough. So we got to reclaim the study of Indian culture, Indian tradition, what I call the Indic traditions. Indic tradition, like America, is one of the most heterodox traditions. Why do you have thousands of gods? The reason is because people recognize there are many paths. Why is it that so many religions have actually existed in India? It's because we recognize that that diversity, you make adjustments rather than put divisiveness. So the divisiveness that comes out of the kind of particular, narrow, exclusive notion of Hinduism is a very new phenomenon. It did not exist always as part of India. And historians have proved that again and again, but we don't teach that history. We don't, I mean, I, for example, have another project that I have in mind with a colleague of mine to really look at pre-modern, pre-colonial India and how Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists actually work together. And there are lots and lots of evidence, art historically, culturally, and otherwise. That needs to come out. So we need serious study of that earlier material. I'm not talking about idealistic thing, but how people make accommodation. That there were things that you didn't do with other groups, as it's true of caste. There were things you didn't do between caste, but there were things you did do across. So we have to, it's a complex system that we need to actually understand how we can learn from that, rather than buy into the narrow, jingoistic, exclusionary vision of the Indic culture that is actually millennia old.
That's wonderful. Let me bring a younger voice to this conversation. Francis Barth. Great to see you here, Francis.
You as well. I appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit. First, congrats on the book. I think it's the general notion is so needed today. I would say from my younger perspective, I'm a freshman right now in college. Something I find interesting is that when we think about learning languages in particular as a means for this global citizenship or participation in this greater conversation, it's too often associated with whether it's literature or the arts or humanities. And not to say that these topics aren't necessary, but it's too often viewed as not something to actually be paired with whether it's numerical analysis or political analysis or genuinely approaching institutions and really affecting change in the world or whatever it is. And so personally, I'm trying to improve my Spanish, and I'm trying to begin to learn a couple other languages. But in large part, I find that whether it's K through 12 or even the rigor I find at Princeton, I think we don't devote enough intensity or enough agency even to students in making this happen.
Totally, because I think it has
Thank you.
something to do with language education. And I feel that so much of it is about language qua language, as if it exists in isolation, rather than language as a window into the culture. So I'll give you an example. At the Asian Society, we, as you may know, we're working very hard to have Chinese language be part of the system, and we do these national courses and stuff like that. And I was on the Today Show when we were doing this conference, and it was a reporter who said to me, "But tell me, why should I learn Chinese? Everybody speaks English. I go into the farther corner of Africa and people can speak English." And I said, because there are two things. One is language is a window onto that society and a culture, the way people think. Secondly, it also shows some humility on your part, that you are going to make some effort to learn somebody else's language, rather than always expecting that other people are going to learn yours. And thirdly, understanding that language can also help you understand why people think the way they do. So you're very right that in big foreign policy analysis, now people are beginning to think that actually it used to be that foreign service officers learned languages because it was important for them to understand how people are thinking from that other part. But I do think that because of the world we live in now, English is becoming more a lingua franca than it used to be. So Foreign languages, actually, if you study, and most of the higher educations, foreign languages have started going down. People are not studying it as much as they were studying it in the 60s. So there was a National Defense Language Act, NDFL, and this was in the 60s. And I had more friends who were studying Chinese, Japanese, even Hindi and Russian. Why? Because the State Department said these are languages of the adversaries, and we better learn about that. And many more people were learning those languages to understand those foreign powers. And gradually that has gone away. So the cause may be a little problematic, I understand that. But lots of my friends actually had their graduate school completely paid for through those kinds of grants. So we have this ironic moment, the world is getting closer, and we're actually moving away sometimes from thinking and doing things that were helpful to us to be in the world. So, very good question. And I'm glad that you brought that up, Francis.
So we have time for one last question, and then we're going to bring this to a close. Pedro?
Hi, Vishakha. Thank you for words in your speech. I would like you to go further in your analysis about the ultranationalist movement that we have now worldwide. So I would like to hear from you about the movement that we have in Brazil and Hungary, and we used to have about the former US president.
Tell me a little bit more about the question. I'm not sure if I understand.
Sure. Yes, because as you say that maybe your book may be too idealistic in the moment, I would like to hear from you about how you trying to change the mind of the people that sometimes can be involved in this movement, and sometimes here in South America that we have a lot of this movement now. I would like to hear from you what your perspective about the ultranationalist movement
Right.
On
Very
this
good.
growing exclusionary
Right,
nationalism.
absolutely. I think about that a lot, and I realize that there's going to be a hardcore group, right, that I'm not sure I can change. And I don't know if this book would even be of interest to them. And that's okay. But what I am interested in is that people who are in between, or at least people who feel like they're grasping to understand how to get from here to there. So this book is really for those people who have at least a little bit of open mind, at least some interest in trying to say, how do I make sense of where I am, where this world is? And if for those people, it spurs them on to doing some things, both at home, locally, or nationally, or globally, that would be good. So I recognize that for a certain group of people who are so completely bent on their exclusionary rhetoric, I'm not sure that I want to bang my head against the wall. But I do look for that glass half full and people in between the half full, half empty, if we can move the glass to be fuller as it goes forward.
Thank you,
Vishakha, thank you so much for that question, Pedro. Vishakha, thank you so much for the work that you have done to promote global citizenship, for taking the time to write this book, which is honest, authentic, moving many times, humorous at times as well, and very deep and very appropriate for the moment. And thank you for making the time to be with us today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to close this event. And thank you all so much for coming.
Well, first of all, thank you, Fernando, for really spurring this conversation, having wonderful people from all over the world coming in, both educators and others who are part of this discussion, because the main purpose of writing this book is to be a catalytic force for discussion, and a discussion that can go to other levels. So when Maritza asked me now, what kind of courses could this book be used for? I want to ask all of you to see how we can figure this out. Not just this book, but how can that be injected into other conversations? So I know for me, young people are a very important part of my desire to have this book actually spurring on other discussions. And wherever we can do that would be great. I'd love to know from all of you how we can do that. And I have some thoughts as well. So let's stay in touch, because this is really a discussion that is not just 1 hour long. It's not a discussion just about you reading the book, although I would love for you to read the book and tell me what you think. But it is about the points that we need to get from here to there and how best we can do that.
Vishakha, this has been splendid. In the background, I've been getting emails from students saying, what can we do to translate this into Spanish? This is so timely. And so I'll be introducing you to those people. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a wonderful conversation on a Friday at lunchtime. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day and be safe in India.
Thank you, Vishakha.
Thank you.